Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, welcome to all our attendees today. March 3rd, the blue economy is the topic. I'm Millie Pitts with Ocean Exchange, and I want to welcome all of you who are either MTS members, or you signed up through MTS, or you're friends of Ocean Exchange. We are really delighted to have this collaboration with the Marine Technology Society for a series of webcasts. This is the Kickoff webcast, and you're going to hear a lot about the blue economy. Every month thereafter, we'll have another webcast, and we'll take a deeper dive into some of these verticals. A little bit about Ocean Exchange. Well, here's our agenda first, of course, and we'll cover this in a little bit more detail. We have two top-level panelists who are going to talk about the blue economy in a broad aspect, and you're going to be stunned by some of the numbers that they show you. And then we have 5 panelists with 5 different verticals. Next slide. Ocean Exchange is a nonprofit. We're celebrating our 10th anniversary this year. And we're going to have a celebration in Fort Lauderdale in October, and more about that later. We exist for one purpose, and that's to help advance the adoption of innovative solutions that are all about sustainability. We particularly focus on healthy oceans, resilient and sustainable coastal systems. And because of one of our sponsors, we have also a particular focus about sustainable ocean transport. You can see some information there. We're at oceanexchange.org, and I'd like to connect with any and all of you. Next slide. Zdenka.
Great. Hello. I am Zdenka Willis, President of the Marine Technology Society, and I am so excited to be teaming up with the Ocean Exchange for this brand new webinar series. The Marine Technology Society is a professional society. We have 2,000 members in 20 countries, and it was established to make real contributions in fostering progress in marine sciences for the benefit of mankind. Our mission is to facilitate a broader understanding of the relevance of marine technology to wider global issues, to promote and improve marine technology and related education programs, advance the development of tools and procedures required to explore, study, and further the responsible and sustainable uses of the oceans. Our members use marine technologies in a variety of ways to explore the ocean, seas, and lakes, measure and monitor the health of our waters and aquatic centers, predict impact of events, rescue and repair after events, generate energy from renewable sources, extract natural resources, safeguard jurisdictions, innovate new solutions, and educate the next workforce. So while many people wake up and weather's the first thing they think about, not many people wake up thinking that the ocean has any impact on their day. While the ocean influences our daily weather, provides us food, allows the transportation of goods and services, and is the backdrop for recreation and tourism, the importance of the ocean is hidden and a mystery to many. The blue economy is often discussed in a framework of traditional sectors that include shipbuilding, transportation, offshore oil and gas, with emerging sectors that include fisheries and other bioproducts, power generation, and tourism. And Dr. Rick Spinrad, our past president of MTS, has challenged the community to think about a new blue economy, the new blue economy that includes a knowledge-based economy, looking to the sea, not just for extraction of material goods, but for data and information to address societal challenges and inspire solutions. Regardless of how you define the blue economy, we hope that through this series, we can reframe people's perspectives that yes, the ocean is important for our daily lives. So let me turn this over to Dane so we can get started with our fabulous lineup of panelists. Thank you.
Thanks, Zdenka. Hi, everybody. I'm Dane Dunstan. I am the managing partner of Reservoir LLC, which is an advisory company that works with all sorts of organizations, both on business and sustainability. Want to talk about a unique human quality that we have. We have an almost unlimited ability to solve problems. It's really phenomenal what we can do. It's matched only by our ability to cause problems. And if you think about it, going back, it's not just societally, it's individually. Each of us from early childhood learned to solve problems and then often would create a bigger one from our solution until we finally figured out that we didn't have to throw food across the room. I live just outside of Austin, Texas, and some of you may have heard a couple of weeks ago, we had an event that I'm calling the Great Texas Freeze Out. We had temperatures that went down to the lowest in recorded history in this part of the world, with a tremendous amount of damage. They tell us that we were within minutes or even seconds of the entire electric infrastructure of Texas going out. If you think about that, that would be like all the lights in Spain being turned off for weeks at a time until they could restore it. We were very close to a huge, huge disaster. In the middle of all that, we had a period one afternoon where we had a few hours of power in our house. We were having rolling blackouts. And my wife and I turned on the TV and watched the Mars Perseverance module landing on Mars. That is an effort that would be like throwing a dart from Washington, D.C. and having it hit a target in Dallas. A huge, huge undertaking. And as we watched this, it was amazing. And the people in there who were cheering, it occurred to me that all those men and women were in Texas. We have people in the midst of all of this who could land that little thing on a little spot on Mars, all those millions of light years away. And here we are trying to figure out how to keep our power going. We're not good at looking upstream. We're good at solving the problems that are around us. We're not great at thinking about something a few years out. The freeze didn't come from not knowing how to solve the problem. There's all sorts of places where there are infrastructures that are protected from hard freeze. The freeze came from people thinking, nah, it'll probably be all right. Nah, what's the worst that could happen? It came from this magical realism thinking of, it's probably not going to happen to me. So what we have today is some expert minds on how we can solve those problems, how we can get upstream of the things that we're experiencing right now and come together with solutions that will turn this around. And as you know, the news is not good. Just in the last couple of days, we've learned that disturbances in the Gulf Stream and the Atlantic are slowing it down slower than it's been in a millennium. I don't know what that does. Some of our experts today may be able to talk about it. But what we're going to do is really dive into not just the blue economy, but what it means to our lives, to our communities, to our society, because this is an important time to take stock. So we're going to talk to some really wonderful people, Claire Joly and Monica Grasso. Claire is the head of the unit for Directorate of Science, Technology, and Innovation at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And Monica is the chief economist, performance, risk, and social science at the NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And then we're going to do some Q&A with them. Then we've got a panel of experts and some more Q&A. You'll see to the side of your panel, there is a place to put questions. So don't put your questions in chat if you wouldn't mind. Put them in the Q&A section. I'll monitor those and I'll try to get to as many of your questions as we possibly can. But it's going to be a really great session here. So I'm really looking forward to it. And let me begin by introducing Claire Joly.
Hello, Dane.
Hi, Claire.
Thank you. Hi, thank you very much for having me here. So in the next 7 minutes or so, I'm gonna have the pleasure of telling you a little bit about how we see the ocean economy from the global perspective. But linking to what Dane just said, the reason why we're looking at the ocean economy today, particularly with these measurement lenses, is that we need evidence so that our policymakers can actually make the best decisions. Hopefully, the more evidence we get, the better decisions, hopefully, we will have. Next, please. So the good news is that we are getting to know much better what is meant by the ocean economy. For us at the OECD, we're a big international economic organization with 37 member states, including the US. We are looking really at the global level. And the ocean economy has two big pillars. The first one is really based on these ocean-based industries, many of which that we will talk about during this webinar. Second major pillar is marine ecosystems. Marine ecosystems upon which many of these ocean-based industries rely on. But how do they interact with each other? To get a better sense of this, we need to get a better idea of their economic, environmental, and social role. Looking particularly at the economic impacts. Next slide, please. The good news is that just in 2.5 years, we've never seen that many ocean economy reports come out. Here are just a few, a little selection, I would say, from our colleagues from Ireland, from the European Union, obviously from the US. Monica Grasso is going to actually zoom in the US ocean economy work. The good news is that we're getting more numbers. We're getting a better sense of how much the ocean represents for our respective economies. Next slide, please. There's also a consensus forming around some of the key sectors that are forming what we call the ocean economy. To give you a sense, a little bit of the many different domains where we're seeing economic impacts, obviously agriculture, fishing, transport. We're going to hear about some of these sectors a bit later in the webinar, but also more recent sectors that are really emerging, like offshore wind, critical sectors for the future that are still very little, I would say, we still have very little data, I would say, on some of the economic impacts of these sectors. Simply because they're still very new in many parts of the world. We're seeing wind farms being built all over the place, I have to say, especially in the past 5 years, but we still need to measure better the economic impacts. Next slide. Now, at the OECD, we're really looking at the ocean economy on a more global level, based particularly on national data that we get from countries. A recent exercise that we conducted had to do with developing countries and the ocean economy, and something that seemed quite obvious for these countries, but that was not probably obvious on the global level, is that they rely a lot on a number of ocean-based sectors. Typically, fisheries is a critical sector for many developing countries, meaning that if the marine environment is not doing well, this clearly impacts directly jobs and their economy. Also, a sector like tourism, that was, of course, disrupted very much so by the COVID-19 crisis, has had some critical impacts in a number of small island states. And something that people don't often realize, it's not only about jobs and getting some revenues, taxation, but it's also sometimes entire economic models that just suddenly disappear. Typically, you have countries like Seychelles that are reliant on tourism for revenues that are then redirected into marine protected areas. Suddenly, you don't have the funding anymore. This means really this importance of actually being able to track the money going into different ocean economy sectors. Next slide, please. So we still have many questions to be answered. We're getting better at a national level. We're getting better at a global level. But although value-added employment are important indicators, we still need to understand better how industries relate to each other. How much value-added is traded. We need to understand better also, obviously, the impacts on the environment and how to remedy some of the bad investments that are made in some economic sectors. Next slide. And also, the ocean economy is actually undergoing structural changes right now. We will hear about this later in the webinar, but right now, the oil and gas sector represents the largest economic sector in the ocean economy. That's really the largest economic sector. But it's going through a major change. not only because of the COVID-19 crisis, but also because of this transition, this needed transition in a low carbon economy. This means also many changes in terms of employment, and the structure of the industry itself is changing. How do you actually capture this in official statistics? That's very, very important. That's the daily livelihood of many, many people around the world, from Texas all the way to Nigeria. Next slide, please. And it's not only the energy sector, aquaculture. Now we are really getting to a stage where aquaculture, which has been around for thousands of years, is getting to an industrial scale, meaning you have aquaculture farms popping up in different parts of the world with very strong impacts on the marine environment, and also disruption, because obviously you have competition growing with values attached to farmed fish that may not be as high as what was expected. So here again, structural change. How do you take this into account in official statistics that guide the decisions of policymakers? Next and final slide, please. Well, we are in a stage where we have had, a wealth of economic statistics that have been collected over the past 2 years and a half, especially. But the good news is that we're also getting into a new accounting approach. This is what we call satellite accounts, not space, but really satellite accounts. It's an accounting approach that allows you to create, like for other sectors like tourism, for instance, a dedicated way to measure a domain. For the ocean economy, we have a number of countries, including the US, that is developing experimental satellite account in order to have a better sense of how all the different ocean industries are linking with the economy. This is very, very encouraging. At the OECD, we're working with a number of pilot countries that are all developing or aim to develop satellite accounts dedicated to the ocean economy, the likes of Portugal, Canada, the US, of course, but also Ireland and quite a few others, so that with that type of evidence, we can actually then create the good linkages in order to track better the use of natural resources in ocean economic activities and measure better the environmental effects of particular industries. This is a bit technical, but this is going to be crucial, and the decisions of tomorrow will definitely be based on that type of data. So we have a blueprint for improved international economy statistics that's coming out in the next few weeks, with a lot of information on definitions. And with this, next slide maybe, I'll let you explore some of these recent OECD reports that could actually provide you with a bit more data, statistics about the global ocean economy. So thanks again very much for the invitation, and looking forward to the questions. Dane?
Claire, thank you. That was great. If you'll stay around, I'm going to come back to you in a little while with some questions about that data and how we can use it. But let's move on. And Monica, let me hand over to you and talk about, how we can do better with the data that we're getting and what you're learning. Monica Grasso.
Thank you, Dane. And I'm very, very excited to be here today. And thanks to MTS and the Ocean Exchange for organizing this event. So as Claire presented to you today, she presented the global perspective of measuring the ocean economy. And now I'm going to be talking about the US efforts in measuring, getting to know better our marine ocean economy. So just to give you a little bit of background, last summer, NOAA and the Bureau of Economic Analysis released the first of a kind report for the US, characterizing the US ocean economy. And if you don't know the Bureau of Economic Analysis, it is our official statistical agency that publishes the US gross domestic product. So we use the methodology, we align our methodology with the generation of GDP in the US. And this is a joint project. It took us more than 3 years of collaboration and decades of building and decades of research on to define the US economy. ocean economy. In this statistics, we are measuring what we call the ocean-dependent activities and industries, and we have statistics from 2014 to 2018. And this marine statistics just begin to clarify how dependent America is on our waters and establish the baseline for understanding the importance of the marine dependent sectors. This is definitely the most comprehensive and accurate marine statistics that we have been produced to date at national level in the US. It is a prototype. It is a stage before the experimental satellite account, as Claire said, but we are making major refinements. We collect comments from industries and academia, and we expect to release the new numbers this summer. Next slide, please. Just to clarify our definition of marine ocean dependency. So I'll say the first and probably the most important step in developing the statistics is to define what and how you're gonna account as ocean dependent industries. As you see in the slide, these are the definitions we use to include the industries and activities in our statistics. So they are activities that take place in the marine environment, such as marine transportation and fishing, use essential inputs from the marine environment, such as seafood processing, produce goods and services, mainly for use in the marine environment. It would not take place if not located in the proximity of the marine environment, such as hotels and vacation rental properties. Next slide, please. And here is just to illustrate our definition of marine waters. So in this statistics I'm going to show you later in the presentation, we have include activities that occur in the ocean inside the EEZ, but also in major water bodies, such as Gulf of Mexico, Great Lakes, Chesapeake Bay, and in US shorelines directly adjacent to these waters, and also inland waters leading to international shipping terminals. And I would say the most innovative aspect of this statistics that we are also measuring the ocean-dependent activities occurring inland areas of the US. We have developed what we call coefficients to measure the portion of the US activities which receive essential inputs from the marine waters, no matter how far inland you are. So this is a major achievement of this effort and captures a comprehensive picture of the US economy. Next slide, please. So here we have the 10 sectors. We developed statistics for 10 distinct sectors. We also provide data for more than 40 industry groups within those 10 sectors. And most of them are self-explanatory. I just want to call attention for some of them. For example, fisheries. We have the fisheries and other bioproducts that includes, of course, commercial fisheries, marine aquaculture, seafood processing, but also includes other marine living resources products such as marine feed and the emerging marine pharmaceutical industry as well. We have research and education, includes government, industries, academia, labs, and other institutes' investments on marine research and education. It also includes associated research devices and equipment production that are mainly used in marine research. Then we have the professional business and business services, that is basically consulting, trade, legal, any professional and business services that are specialized in ocean-related affairs. Dredging, restoration, other constructions, basically, I think it's self-explanatory. I just want to highlight that it does include habitat conservation and restoration projects in this sector. Then national defense and public administration, we have divided the defense and non-defense investments. Offshore oil and gas includes at this point mainly extraction of oil and natural gas, marine transportation, shipbuilding. They're very self-explanatory, tourism, recreation, and then finally the power generation. That for now we're including just electric power at this point, but we will be incorporating renewable energy. It reaches to a measurable level, because this is a national account, so it needs to be a measurable level. So next slide, please. And here just high-level results. So in 2018, the marine economy in the US accounted for 1.8% of the GDP. And this can sound small, but it's about the same share as in other mature and complex economies around the world. And this slide it's actually just to provide you some comparison with other known industries, such as agriculture, the IT services, that is data processing, internet publishing, and utilities. So you can see that the ocean economy is significant. It has a significant contribution to the US economy. Next slide, please. And this one basically is just to comparing the US, the ocean economy with the US economy. So you see that the ocean economy grew about the same rate as the US economy in 2018, a little bit faster in GDP, and a little slower in comparison to employment. And then the next slide, please. And here in this slide, we just show the percentage contribution from each activity in the statistics. And this, as you can see, the tourism recreation is a big portion, huge portion of our US marine economy. And next slide, just to close, this is my last slide. So understanding the size and the scope of the US economy will help, we believe it will help government agencies, private investors, entrepreneurs on issues related to policy and decide future investments. It also can help identify vulnerable industries and develop targeted programs and investments. And in addition, if we are able to maintain this information over time, it can be used to monitor trends, highlight emerging industries, and show dependencies between the industries. And in the case, for example, of COVID-19, this data serves as a baseline to measure the COVID-19 impact on the ocean economy. So if you're interested in the prototype materials, it's all in the BEA website here in the slides, and we also have an email that you can send any questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Monica. That's great. And Claire, if we can get you back, got a couple of questions. And Claire, this may be for you or it may be for both of you. Jose Barros says that we may be missing a reference to the contribution of telecom submarine cables to the blue economy as getting language, getting information, particularly on seismic and environmental data. Would you want to say anything about that?
Monica, or should I? Well, there may be two points here of interest. First, indeed, telecommunication cables are essential, and they're part of the infrastructure that actually is being put on the seafloor, and that's critical for many of our economies. So indeed, that's the type of infrastructure that we need to be taking into account in the ocean economy in general. That's for sure. Still, it's very hard to get data sometimes, official statistics. But this is definitely a sector that we need to include down the road. And the second element, quickly, we had a number of workshops on the importance of using the existing infrastructure or the future infrastructure on the seafloor to actually monitor the marine environment. That's part of the science and technology work we're doing. And we do believe that indeed communication cables could be a great way to actually get sensors in very, hard to get places down the road. And we believe that there may be some very nice public-private partnerships that could be put in place here.
And
Thanks, Claire.
I just want to
Go ahead,
add
Monica.
that if we are, you're completely right, and we are working actually understanding not just the telecommunication cables, but other what we call the blue technology, and how we can better account for this blue technology, as it is an input to the production, right? So we are working on trying to develop measures to that. It's not, as Claire said, it's not straightforward, not that easy. It does require a lot of research and time, but we are looking into that.
Monica, we had a question. Before I go on, Phil Menard had a question about wind farms, but I'm going to save that for Michael Olson's section because I think it's more applicable there. Monica, why are national defense and public administration data linked together? Could there be valuable insights generated if these were considered separately?
So we did, at our first cut was to put the public investments in one sector, but we look at them separately. So we do have statistics for them separately. If you go to our documentation, you can see the numbers separately. So definitely defense is a big chunk of the government investment, and you'll be able to see that in the statistics. So although they are in one sector, we have separate numbers, and be happy to share that. It's all in the BA website that I provided. You can download the spreadsheet and you see specific numbers. Just don't have time to go through all of them here.
That's great. Well, Claire and Monica, thank you so much, and please stay around. We're going to meet our other panelists now, and then at the end, I want you coming back with some questions for them, if you would.
Sounds great.
And for those of you, we've gotten from Rick Spinrad and Omnia Ibrahim some questions that are fairly technical. And what I'd like to do is save those for afterwards. We do a post-event gathering. So if you want to stay on afterwards, we'll have our experts stay on and address some of the more technical questions that are not for general audience. So thank you for those questions. And let me move on now. We've got some great areas that we've just covered in general. Let's dive in and let's start with wind energy. Michael Olson. Michael?
Thank you, Dane. Thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I assume unless you flag me down, you can hear me and everyone else can hear as well. So as Dane said, my name is Mike Olson. I'm with a company called Equinor. Equinor is an energy company headquartered in Norway with a focus on offshore wind energy. I'm sorry, with a focus on energy development, both conventional in oil and gas, but also offshore wind, which is what's most relevant for the conversation today. Offshore wind, thank you very much. First slide. Offshore wind presents some very significant opportunities in various different ways. Renewable energy generation, job creation, economic development, and a solution to climate change. And I'll talk a little bit more about each one of these as I go along. Next slide. So why offshore wind? What's so great about this? It's clean, renewable, reliable, with average capacity factors typically higher than other renewable energy sources. Approximately, as you all are very well aware, 50%, 40%, depending on, I guess, who you're asking or what you're looking at. 50% of the U.S. population lives within 50 miles of the coast, which is great because you can site offshore wind very, very close to load centers, to where the demand is. As you can see from this map, the wind speeds are significant offshore. The wind blows generally stronger and more consistent than onshore wind. And it also blows in the evening, for example, and that makes it a great supplement to solar, which of course, as the sun goes down, in the evening, demand is going up, particularly during the summer when people are coming home from work and firing up their air conditioners or lights or whatever else. And then building commercial scale offshore wind facilities will spur tens of billions of dollars in private investment and grow thousands of well-paying US jobs. Slide 3, please. As you can see here, there are a number of states on the East Coast that are highlighted. And what I wanted to point out is that states really drive the demand for offshore wind. And as we'll see on the next slide, not quite yet, the federal government is responsible for leasing the areas offshore where offshore wind is developed. But these states here that are shown have specific targets in place that will get us on our way to 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. Currently, there are 25.4 gigawatts in offshore wind targets among these states that you see here. These targets were either put in place by the state's governor or through legislation that was enacted and signed into law. And then in the fine print down there at the bottom, you see that 30 gigawatts of offshore wind will power approximately 20 million homes. So this is real, legitimate, and significant. Next slide. I apologize for the size here, especially for those of you who are looking at this on a tablet, but what you can see there are existing offshore wind leases. And it's both leases as well as what are called call areas, which is what the federal government puts out for public comment proposing future leasing. But the point here is that there are 23 gigawatts of sea space in existing leases, 23 gigawatts worth or sea space enough to generate 23 gigawatts of offshore wind. Moreover, there are 11.6 gigawatts under contract between developers and the states that were on the previous slide for the delivery of offshore wind. And then the last thing I'll say on this slide is that the leaseholders here represent some very, very large companies that are well funded or that have resources to invest the billions that are required to develop these offshore wind projects. Next slide. I think this one speaks for itself, but just to highlight this, the jobs and the economic benefit to the US economy are significant. So developing 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 is expected to generate around 83,000 jobs. Of those 83,000, 59,000 will come from project development and construction. And then the last thing I'll highlight is that the offshore wind industry will invest approximately $57 billion in the US economy by 2030. So these are real numbers, real jobs and real money that the industry will be investing in the US. Next slide. So the last thing I want to touch on real quickly, and I would be remiss if I did not, is the president's recent executive order on addressing climate change. I think it's important to note that offshore wind was specifically singled out as a solution to the, quote, climate crisis. And I think that's important for a couple of reasons. One is that it raises the importance of offshore wind from a tool in the energy toolbox, or as an economic development initiative, or simply a mechanism to create jobs. But it raises it to the level of a solution to a national crisis. And I think it puts federal agencies and departments with a role in permitting or who have a concern with offshore wind on notice that this is a that this is a priority for the Biden administration. Now, that does not mean that the path to permitting offshore wind is smooth, that there aren't detractors, that there aren't opponents, that there aren't conflicts, but the bottom line is we are in a very favorable political environment for the development of this resource. Next slide, I think, is the last one, and I will turn it back over to you, Dane.
Hey, Michael, thank you. That was great. We've got a bunch of questions for you on the wind farms and the wind energy. We'll come back to those at the end. But I just want to say that if anybody in Texas needs to know how to winterize a windmill, they ought to call you guys in Norway. And next, Lynette Cardock with Moffitt and Nickel. Lynette, hi, how are you?
Hi, thanks for having me here today. And I'm going to be fast and furious as I go through some slides and talk about coastal infrastructure. And I'm looking forward to the questions and answers at the end of our session. So the first place I'd like to start is on that definition of resiliency. I work as the Director of Resilience and Adaptation for Moffitt and Nickel, and it's one of the questions we get a lot is, well, how do you define it? And it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and quite frankly, that's okay, because it really comes down to being able to have that operational continuity, business continuity, whatever it is that you might be doing. If you're a water or wastewater provider providing those services, if you're a mayor and keeping a community safe, whatever it might be, it's being able to have, as the military here call, mission readiness and the ability to bounce back. So next slide. For us at Moffitt and Nickel, we really work with at any land water interface. I think we're probably best known for some of the work that we do in ports and marinas around the world, but we also do the softer side of large-scale ecosystem restoration, and all of those things contribute to the health and well-being of our coastal communities. Next slide. Now, this slide is the one that I really like to use as we're starting to think about the foundational principles in coastal resiliency and coastal infrastructure. And this was a devastating event with Hurricane Michael that ripped through the panhandle of Florida, and this is specifically Mexico Beach. And it really highlights three things. The first one is the interconnectivity of all our systems. So our roadways, our water, our wastewater, all of those lifeline systems are truly linked together. And quite frankly, we saw that recently also with the incident in Texas and the collapse of the electrical grid leading to pipes also freezing, and then issues with broken pipelines and water supply being disrupted, and in some areas continues to be disrupted. The second thing I like to point out about this picture is that whole concept of having an asset that's resilient versus a system that's resilient. And what we see here is this gentleman built a very, very resilient house, but it occurs in a system that is obviously just not resilient. And so while he may be able to have that structure and see that structure standing and be able to, I guess, occupy it, by the time electricity, water, all the services that need to come back to that area really leave them with a stranded asset. And really the third one is thinking about acute shocks and chronic stressors. This is an example of an acute shock. As we like to talk about in the resiliency world, acute shocks are the things that kind of just knock you over the head, and chronic stressors that drip that just erodes at your community fiber, making it difficult for anything to bounce back from the acute shocks. So next slide. Part of our emphasis on looking at these, what I tend to call them like big daddy events, there's a lot of concerns over these large weather events and large climatic disasters and their implication to the local economy. And, and it makes a lot of sense because here, these are just the the billion-dollar events, $22 billion events that we had last year. And for us on the coastline, it's not just the amount of events that are happening, it's that we have a large concentration of wealth. I think Michael mentioned 40 to 50% of the population are on the coastline or in the coastal zone. And so as we continue to concentrate wealth, these events that continue to hit our shorelines and our coastlines are really going to continue to impact and disrupt the economy that we have in this coastal zone. Next slide. The chronic stressors, probably the one that we talk about the most tends to be aging infrastructure, as we see all these cities around the United States with failing water systems, failing electrical grid, et cetera. And then it's coupled with that creeping sea level rise that we see causing issues of sluggish drainage, broad mobility concerns, et cetera. And one thing that the pandemic has really brought to us now is this emphasis on air quality. So not just thinking about it in terms of NOx and SOx, so nitrogen oxides and sulfur oxides, it's about the ability to have these open spaces. And so it's been very interesting to see the shift with our waterfront group and the folks that are out there creating open spaces and parks, that the conversation hasn't just been about having access and community benefits with the recreational. It's also now shifted to a public health concern and a public health benefit that's coming to these coastal communities that have these open areas as well. And finally, the issues of water quality. For us that rely on tourism, one of the areas that's very important for us down in Miami, the water quality is important to continue to attract folks, and obviously for all the resources that all the fishing and other activities, economic activities. Next slide. So, I have to say that it's not very often that I look at a D+ infrastructure rating, with certain glee. And actually, they released a new report card today, and we moved up a little bit to C- in our overall infrastructure. But what it tells us is really, when we're looking at the degree of poor, very poor, and life elapsed assets, is that we kind of have a do-over. We have an ability now to recreate a lot of these infrastructure systems in a way that are much more resilient and more robust for the challenges of the future. So while it is a real bummer that our infrastructure is failing, this opportunity allows us to recreate a future and reimagine a future. And so my next slide. And so as we look at spending for the future, part of it is that I truly believe that infrastructure spending can help transform a community. And this is a conceptual design that we just recently made in response to the Corps of Engineers is doing a study down in South Florida looking at reducing storm risk from storm surge. So storm surge risk reduction. And their initial report has come out with a potential proposal of a seawall, in some areas potentially up to 18 feet. So that's caused some pause, concern, and item for pause to look at how do we reimagine our coastline, particularly in urban areas that have such important economic impacts. And this is one of those ways, being able to create nature-based systems and integrating them with structural solutions. So I look forward to talking more about this incorporation of items like oyster reefs and mangroves for wave absorption, linking it to an integrated stormwater system. But I'll stop there and wait for questions, and thank you for the opportunity. Clearly, I'm passionate about all things coastal, so thank you.
Lynette, thank you very, very much. And I love that seawall there. That's pretty inventive. But we'll have questions. We've got some questions for you, and then we're going to go on to Roger. Next slide. Hey, Roger, how are you?
Hey, Dane. Good day to you, sir. Great to be here.
Roger's here to talk about the decarbonation of shipping, which is something he and I have had many discussions over. So, Roger, tell us about where we are right now.
Thank you very much, Dane. And I'm going to talk about shipping. I work for Wallenius Wilhelmsen, which is quite a large company that most people have never heard of. We are the biggest carrier of vehicles by ship in the world. And as shipping, we have a really fundamental challenge to face, and that's decarbonization. You can describe this as the challenge of our generation. So next slide, please. Where I want to start off is that shipping it might be the original global industry, but it's also a hidden industry. It's not foremost to mind for most people in their everyday lives. But at the same time, it's really indispensable to the world economy and of course to the blue economy. It's the 90% of everything industry, which means is about 90% of all products that are moved at some stage in their life cycle, they're moved by ship. That's really indicates how fundamental shipping is as an industry. Now, I think as we've already seen, and I think this will be not a controversial point to make, especially in this group, is that the science is very clear. we need to reduce the emissions. And shipping is producing around about 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year at the moment. And we need to phase that out entirely. So it's a big challenge in shipping, and I'll come more to that. I get to that now a little on the next slide. But what we can say at the moment is that it's very unclear on what the right technology path is to choose to achieve this decarbonization. It's going to vary a lot from one branch of shipping to the next. It's also very uncertain how certain markets will develop in respond. And so all of that and uncertainty, that can really strike you as a big threat. But that's not how we view this. It is a huge challenge, and we're respectful, we're humble about that. But we know that at the end of all of this change, there will still be shipping. And so we see this as certainty as an enormous opportunity as well. Next slide. So in shipping, I said it was a big challenge for us, and I really mean that to give you an idea of how much energy we're talking about. We did this rough calculation recently. One of the vessels that you see pictured here, it will use about as much energy in one day while it's sailing as a normal house would use for heating purposes in 110 years. It gives you an idea of just the scale of which for large international trading vessels like this are operating on. And then when you consider that what that means in terms of energy storage on board for a vessel that may only replenish 3 times a year, I think you can start to see how much of a challenge we have technically as well as operationally to reduce emissions, particularly to reduce them to zero. But we do need to reduce them to zero, and part of that is it's not just because of regulation, but it's also because it's a business risk issue. If you think about it, one of the big uncertainties we have is how regulation is going to develop, how it's going to affect our business. And one thing that we know is that if the vessels do not have a funnel, in other words, if they're zero emission, they're insulated against the uncertainty of further regulatory development. So that has to be our goal. And I know that this is a challenge which is enormous to meet in terms of cost and technically today. You'll very often ask people, well, will the market sustain the additional cost that this might bring? And I think if we look at it in a cost competitive basis today, a lot of the new technologies, they're not going to gain traction. However, it's important to remember that the frame of reference of shipping is changing. And it's changing because regulation is seeking to make the cleaner technologies cost competitive relative to the older, less clean technologies. Also, demand is changing, not just on the commercial side, but also on the financial side. The expectation of our investors and our lenders, those are all increasing, and that's helping pushing us towards this cleaner paradigm for the future. So my point is that what is uncompetitive today won't necessarily remain uncompetitive as time goes along. Next slide. So I think that when we're looking at new technologies, we need to think really big and really imaginative, but we also need to deal with this dilemma of timing. Do we want to be in the situation of being the early bird that gets the worm? Or is it actually more like a case of it's the second mouse that gets the cheese? If you go too soon, is that going to be end up disadvantaging you? And what we would certainly argue at Wallenius Wilhelmsen, that it's just waiting, sitting back and watching how things develop, that might have been okay as for some, not for us, in the past when the stakes were a lot lower. But now what we're dealing with decarbonization, this is not just the way we deal with it is not just going to determine whether we are successful in the future, it'll determine whether we survive. And so for us to engage is absolutely essential. We need to be cautious in shipping because the consequences when things go wrong are really dramatic and they're really fast. People will lose lives, vessels will sink. It's just not a situation that you can afford to play fast and loose with. So at the same time, we can't afford to be conservative. If there was ever a need to think big and be bold, this is it. And it's with that idea, with that belief in mind, that we've debuted the Orcelle Wind, which is a concept vessel you see pictured here. It'll be the first deep sea ro-ro vessel. Ro-ro, incidentally, has nothing to do with oars. It stands for roll on, roll off. It speaks to the kind of cargo that we carry. And it'll be predominantly wind powered. It would be the largest sail powered vessel in the world. It's a full scale ship. It'll be around 220 meters long and be able to carry about 7,000 cars at a time. There are a lot of questions that we still need to answer before we can press the button to go ahead with building this ship. It needs to make sense from a technical perspective, and it needs to check out from an operational, a commercial, a financial perspective as well. And we're running a really exhaustive evaluation of all of those different aspects. But it's not a dispassionate analysis that we're doing. We're willing for this to be a success, to find a business case that supports this, the development of this. And I think that while I say that this is a bold measure by today's standards, we think long in shipping. The lifetime of a vessel is the same as a generation. It's around 30 years. And so we think far, far into the future. And what occupies our minds is not just, is this bold in terms of today, but will it still be a bold concept or bold enough in 5 or 10 or 15 years from now? So that's our approach, a little bit of our thinking on this challenge that we have in decarbonization. One thing that we know, and which is a critical part of our involvement with the Ocean Exchange, which we're a proud sponsor of, is that ideas are what's going to get us move us forward. So that takes me to the last slide. We're always open to new ideas. It doesn't necessarily have to be ideas from our industry. In fact, our challenges are about energy storage and energy generation, and those challenges are common to many industrial segments. So thank you very much for your attention.
Roger, that's great. We're going to have a bunch of questions on shipping and technology for that. Let's move on to Erica Feller. Erica, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks, Dane. Hi, so I'm Erica Feller. I'm here to talk about contributions of living marine resources to the blue economy. I work for the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, which I'm certain most of you have probably never heard of. We are a US-based nonprofit, and we're kind of a creative model. NFWF was chartered by Congress in 1984 to create a mechanism to bring together conservation investments from the federal government and the private sector, so that together we can have a greater impact for conservation on the ground than we could each have separately. And so NFWF works in partnership with federal agencies from NOAA and the Fish and Wildlife Service to the Department of Defense. We also work with industry sectors, including energy, agriculture, entertainment, reinsurance, communications, and manufacturing and retail sectors, and more. So I want to spend my 6 minutes here to highlight a few areas where we work, where I see a strong connection between healthy living marine resources and ocean ecosystems and the blue economy. Next slide, please. So, previous speakers have talked about the economic sectors that rely directly on living marine resources. We know that billions of people rely on fisheries and healthy marine ecosystems to support them for their livelihoods and as a source of food. And NFWF invests in local fisheries all around the US. And the impact that we're seeing and working to measure is that these investments not only contribute to maintaining harvest within sustainable limits, but that they also preserve fishers' access to the resource and enhance the well-being of the fishermen and their communities. Next slide, please. And NFWF invests in sea turtle conservation. We focus on 4 populations that are kind of span the Western Hemisphere. And much of this work is community-based, and it gets everybody in the community involved, especially kids. And we know that studies show that when kids spend time in nature, it enhances imagination and attention. It decreases aggression and boosts classroom performance. And we know that children who spend time in nature regularly become better adult stewards of the environment, and hopefully will become part of a more creative and passionate about conservation workforce that's going to find solutions to all the problems that people have talked about. Next slide, please. And Lynette has talked very eloquently about the value of natural systems as part of a resilience strategy. We're talking about beaches and dunes and salt marshes and coral reefs are part of what the strategies communities are coming up with to adapt and become more resilient in the face of climate-related impacts. And so I want to talk about, next slide, please. One of our grantees is an organization called Force Blue. They are a nonprofit organization that retrains and redeploys former special operations veterans and military trained combat divers to assist in marine and coral reef conservation efforts. It is a really great skill set to bring to conservation, but it also provides a transformative and mission focused opportunity for combat veterans who are struggling to adjust to civilian life. And so amid all the destruction following Hurricanes Maria and Irma in Puerto Rico in 2017 was damage to coral reefs that surround and protect the island. Force Blue worked with NOAA and NIFWF to deploy an emergency effort to quickly recover and reassemble the reef structure. And they help to conserve the ecosystem and the benefits it provides to the neighboring community. And it also gave these women and men significant personal benefit from the experience. Next slide, please. And that kind of brings me to the last thought here of thinking about the contribution and value of the restoration economy and the bigger picture of the blue economy. We've lost a lot. And coastal and marine ecosystems are changing rapidly. There is an ever-growing need to think about how we want these systems to look, what we want them to do for us on into the future. We know that restoration, construction, and maintenance of critical natural infrastructure, it's good for fish and wildlife, it's good for coastal and ocean ecosystems, it's also good for people, and it's good for jobs. NIFWF did an analysis of our grant making and looked at how our conservation efforts are measured in jobs compared to other industries, and it compares quite well. We average about 14 total jobs per $1 million of investment. So that analysis was looking at everything we do across all 50 US states, but we found that the coastal conservation work we could measure is consistent with this overall average, both in the overall numbers, but also if you break it down and you look at direct, indirect, and induced employment associated with these awards. So NIFWF type projects further tend to support localized employment and economic benefits while supporting some pretty well-paying jobs. Next slide, please. So that's what I have. I'm delighted to answer questions if people want to email me. And Dane, thank you. I look forward to the discussion.
Erica, this is great. I love your simple slides there. They're beautiful. So next we've got Barbara Ryan. Barbara's the Executive Director of the World Geospatial Industry Council. And if you'll bring your camera up, Barbara, I'm going to turn it over to you. Hey, how are you?
Very good, thanks, Dane. And listen, thanks, congratulations on the 10-year anniversary for the webinar series. That's pretty amazing, so nice work there. Yeah, I am also representing a not-for-profit organization. It's an industry association, though. Let's go, and it's the World Geospatial Industry Council. So this session, or the next couple minutes, we're just going to talk about data for actually many of the topics that we've already talked about earlier in the session. Let's go to the next slide. So if I just maybe look at an overview for the talk, I really would like to start out with this quote from the 1400s, realize that everything connects to everything else. This is something Leonardo da Vinci said back in that time frame, and it's so true. We'll build on that a little bit more. I'd like to use some experience from the terrestrial observation side to bring to the ocean side. I'd like to add that the role of open data, I'd really like to do a little bit deeper dive into the role of open data, particularly that public institutions collect, and then end with the way forward. Next slide. So listen, the Earth is an interconnected system. You heard that from Stenka in her very first remarks about the ocean influencing the weather system. Dane, you talked about the storm. I think Lynette talked about just weather and climate disasters and how much they affect everything. So I think everyone understands that whether it's terrestrial, atmospheric, oceanic, or cryogenic parts, the cryosphere part of the Earth is connected. What we don't often think about, though, is that we collect data in each of those disciplines or each of those areas or domains, and oftentimes the data is not shared back and forth, even though the Earth really is an interconnected system. So again, this kind of comes back to just the importance of the integration of our data and our analyses, like we know the Earth is an integrated system. Next slide. There are some enabling conditions that I would say are going to be essential for the blue economy. Certainly better integration and coordination. Open data, we'll do a deeper dive on that. Build on what's been done. And then also I'd like to end with kind of hyper partnering. Just kind of taking partnering to a new level. I think the linkages to these policy mandates that you see down at the bottom, whether it's the Paris Agreement, the Sendai Framework for Disasters, or the UN Sustainable Development Goals, are really important. I don't mention those specifically more than on this slide, but the more that we can tie our work into those policy mandates, I think it's actually a good mechanism because you've got member states that are agreeing or signing up to these policy mandates, and so those member states or countries are kind of in the middle. You've got these policy mandates above, you've got us doing work below, and I think it can be a good forcing function if we tie into this policy work. And that's all I'm going to say about that piece right now. Next slide. So let's build on what's been done. This is a graph showing some work that the U.S. Geological Survey, an organization I used to work with, and NOAA did. If you know, in the United States, the U.S. Geological Survey kind of maps land. NOAA obviously maps oceans and the coastal area. And you wouldn't believe how many fights we used to have about what's the coastline. You know, is it high mean tide? Is it low mean tide? And until we did this work, which was a seamless topography bathymetry map in this area of Tampa Bay, we had a lot of fights. As soon as we got to this seamless map from land to ocean, you could actually put your coastline in as a vector line, as a line wherever you wanted it, depending on the application that you actually needed. So the point was, it was really important for NOAA and the U.S. Geological Survey to come together. But these next couple slides are going to show some existing work that we just need to do a better job of building on what's been done. So let's, not only the land-water interface, let's go to the next slide. We've got some companies. This happens to be IIC Technologies, that is a WGIC member, that's doing more detailed work. I think this project that they're focusing on is in Canada. But whether it's increased productivity, remote control, carbon neutral, can go into a subarctic environment. There's a lot of capability out there that needs to be built on. That's just for acquiring data. If we go to the next slide, you're going to see that one of our partners, Esri, is actually doing something in the ocean that we've tried to do on the terrestrial side. On the terrestrial side, we call it data cubes, and we're ingesting, whether it's Landsat or Sentinel data, into cubes, pixels, on how that data is collected, and then be able to look at how that landscape has changed through time. Esri's putting forth an effort for the same thing for ocean cylinders, and I refer you to them for further work on that. Next slide. So let's drill in a little bit to open data. I was with the U.S. Geological Survey for most of my career, 34 years. We managed the Landsat series of satellites. NASA built and launched the satellites, would turn over the operations to the Geological Survey, and we sold that data. The first Landsat satellite went up in 1972, and we were selling the data for $400 or $500 a scene. The series transitioned to the private sector in the mid-'80s. They were selling data for $4,000 or $5,000 a scene. It almost tanked the whole effort, came back to the government. And we were able to make an argument to Congress, to the Office of Management and Budget, that most of the people that are buying those scenes, that happen to be 53 a year, are other government agencies. So we were taking money out of one pocket and putting it into the other. We were finally able to get the government to change the policy. It went from 53 scenes a day to several orders of magnitude, 5,700 scenes a day of data that was getting out the door. But the big story is that an economic analysis that was done on that open data policy generated annually, this work was done in 2011, a return of $1.7 billion to the US, $400 million outside the US, for a global total of $2.1 billion, far exceeding the $4.5 or $5 million that we, the Geological Survey, were bringing into our organization. And so the message here is that for public institutions working in the ocean area, that data has got to be broadly and openly available. We don't say free, because the point is the taxpayers, at least here in the United States, have paid for those government agencies to do this work. That data ought to be an indirect benefit that comes out of that work, so that the private sector can come in and build value-added products and tools on top of that open data, so that universities can get access to that data without having to pay for it. So it's just an overall economic benefit to broad open data. Next slide. And then that really kind of leads me into almost the last talk, which is hyper partnering. Whether it's academia, whether it's not-for-profit organizations, whether it's the public sector or the private sector, if you want to have our analysis of the Earth working as a truly integrated system, then we've just got to do a better job of partnering with different sectors that have expertise in each one of these domains. So I think my last slide, and I'll turn it back to you, Dane, is that we're often fond of saying on the land side, on the terrestrial side, is that countries have borders, Earth observations don't. I do think that the atmospheric and the oceanic community already come to the table with a little bit better understanding of that, but it's still really important to make sure that we all realize we're living on one Earth and all these systems are integrated, and our work really ought to reflect that. Thanks so much. Turn it back to you, Dane.
Barbara, thank you so much. That's really great, and I love that quote. I remember that all the astronauts who went up in space or out to the moon all had a similar experience. They looked back and they had an experience of seeing one Earth in one sphere, and they called it the overview. So I think above all things, we right now need an overview. And so to get that, I'd like to bring back Claire and Monica and the rest of our panelists. If you just fire up your cameras, let's lose the slide so we can see everybody. And let me ask you a question just for everyone. How do we know, how can we manage what's upstream? How can we have a better idea of what problems we're solving and what problems we're creating? How can we accelerate this? I love it when I ask you these questions.
I could have a go at that, Dane. I think from our perspective, what there's an increasing expectation for us to manage the sustainability, not just of our own direct operations, but also of our value chains. We receive continually, we get sustainability questionnaires to complete from both our financial stakeholders and from our customers, and And I think we have to do exactly the same thing with our supplier base. I think that's one way to help drive change through supply chains, through value chains. And so it can be, it can manifest itself in a few ways. It can, you can make requirements specific requirements a condition of doing business. But I think if you just start off with getting the information, getting transparency, that by itself, that will have a beneficial effect.
Yeah. And Roger, I think one of the things I've seen in the last year when at Reservoir, we spent a good amount of time looking at issues, particularly with ports and sustainability in ports, is the shipping industry starts doing, which it is doing, real studies on how to get to zero emissions faster than anybody's asking them to. The downstream results of that, just on the whole areas around, if you get the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach completely zero emissions by the end of this decade, what happens in the surrounding area is dramatic increase in the number of zero emissions trucks that can come, just because the shipping industry is so large, its effect is so powerful. Claire and Monica, I want to ask you to comment. Barb, go ahead.
Well, just real quickly, let me build on that, because I think there's also an opportunity for better public-private partnerships in this area, and that will tie back in that policy mandate about the Paris agreements, so that as the private sector comes, which has largely been a government game, okay, all those UN policies. So as the private sector starts to come into that, I think we'll see, a faster evolution. And just one other thing, why I'm thinking of that, and maybe all of you guys have read this, but the book that was written, A Thread Across the Ocean, The Laying of the First Transatlantic Cable. The author is John Steele Gordon. It's a fascinating read, and it really speaks to, okay, back in the 1800s, the private public sector partnerships that were taking place. Thanks.
Hey, Dane, can I?
In fact, Erica, Jess, jump in.
Sure. I just wanted to add one thing onto this. In terms of this idea of like recognizing the problem and sort of getting in front of it. I think one of the challenges that we experience a lot with our grantees too is that, like Barbara said, there is data, there's a lot of investment in putting these systems together. But one of the things that's unique to the ocean environment is that, the type of data you're collecting, sometimes it has sensitivities around it, and it's different. Like on land, you can walk out and look at stuff, and in the ocean, you need data to figure out what's going on. But then we find connecting these big data systems to the people who are making decisions, like ocean observing system data, getting it into the hands of the local coastal manager who has to figure out about what the resilience project is, or putting it into the hands of the fisherman who needs to understand like where he should be fishing to avoid bycatch. These types of things of connecting the data to the decision makers, building those tools, I think is one of the things that I see it happening, but we could use more of.
That's great. Anyone else want to make a comment? I'm going to go to a question from Phil Menard. What is the status of electric propulsion for commercial ocean-going vessels?
I think maybe I should have a comment on that one. Electric propulsion it's actually not uncommon. You do have some classes of vessels that are using diesel electrical propulsion systems, but I think if the question had to do with electric propulsion from batteries on board, that's not a solution that's viable yet for deep sea vessels. So I gave you an example of about how much energy is stored on board, or a vessel uses for 1 day while underway. Let me express that a different way. You would need 4,000, the energy that's in the same amount of energy as is in the batteries of 4,000 electric vehicles to power a vessel for 1 day. And some of the voyages that we're taking are 16 days from port to port. And that's just a fraction of the time that you would actually need to, to be able to cover between rechargings, so to speak. So the technology, it's just for deep sea shipping, it's not there yet. However, this is a big and varied industry. There are a lot of different parts to it, and battery electric is absolutely viable today and in use for certain types of short sea coastal shipping applications. So we should wish that batteries will get there, but not at the moment, not quite. But ideas welcome.
All right, great. Claire.
Yeah, maybe if I could just add one little thing here. We're looking at innovations, and indeed, I mean, we're still a long way to see electric batteries on ships, except for a number of sectors, particularly ferries, where we're seeing this develop quite fast, especially in Northern Europe, where there are many demonstrators right now, especially in the Norwegian fjords, in order to, carry passenger and transport, obviously some cargoes, but it's still very limited as compared, obviously, to the large shipping lanes that we need to decarbonize. Still, lots of innovations in the past 5 years.
Yeah. One area of innovation that we talked about a few months ago, we had Jolt Energy on, which is a company which makes flow batteries. And they've determined, Roger asked a great question, when a ship comes into port, it has 7 or 8 engines which continue to run and put out diesel fumes to keep the ship running even at 7. We can plug them in some cases to the shore power, but we may be, what did you say, Roger, 3 to 4 years away from possibly having ships be able to run on flow batteries?
Yeah, that's we would hope so. And from an industry perspective, the attraction of that solution is that you can take the benefit of it to any port in the world, whether it's equipped to provide shore power or not. And so there's a really terrific equality of access of that kind of a solution. But again, we're looking about such a huge amount of energy for the large ocean-going vessels that technology is not quite there yet. But I love Claire, your optimistic outlook. And like I say, I mean, the more options that we have, the better, and the sooner we get them, the better.
Yeah. Michael, we had some questions on wind power. This is from Charles Christ. Can you give some insight on the reliability and maintenance intervals and life cycle of offshore wind installations?
Sure. I mean, very, very briefly, I'll just start with the fact that when you get an offshore wind lease, your lease is for 25 years. And so you figure, there's the permitting and there's the construction and so forth that is part of that, but you're looking at a very long life of a wind farm. And of course, there's maintenance that occurs, O&M. I mean, a lot of the jobs that I referred to before will come from that. But I think we think in terms of a 25-year life cycle based on the term of the lease that we get from the federal government. But if there's an extension of that particular lease, there may be opportunities for repowering. So we'll see. I mean, the technology is developing as we speak. A few years ago, we were talking about 10 megawatt machines, and now we're looking at 15 megawatt machines as a base case. So it really depends.
Yeah. There's a question from Omnia Ibrahim. How are the Paris agreements going to help with this? And let me add on to that. The new conference, which is coming up at the end of this year, is it working? Is it making a difference?
Is that one for me, or who's that one for all of us?
Anybody, if you've got an answer.
I would actually like to comment that with shipping, shipping along with aviation wasn't covered by the Paris Agreement, and we're dealing with an unfortunate consequence of that in the industry, and that concerns the 50,000 existing vessels in the world fleet. If we want a step reduction in emissions from those vessels, the best, fastest thing that we can do is to transition to carbon neutral or certainly reduced carbon fuels. However, because there is no incentive, and those fuels are, of course, they're more expensive, considerably more expensive than the fuels that currently they're being used. And you can close that gap through subsidy, but no country is inclined to provide those subsidies because you can't count the emissions benefits towards national contributions. So we're wrestling in, with that issue in the industry. It's a shame that the one thing which could actually really substantially change the performance of such a large existing group of assets is, out of reach because of a policy development.
All right. We're out of time on questions. Oh, Claire, go ahead.
Yeah, if I just may, the Paris Agreement has many, many limitations, but it's still very much a strong incentive for a number of governments to change their energy mix. And this is something we're seeing very much, particularly in Europe, but also in Asia. So that's something to keep in mind. And just for shipping, I agree that there's this whole issue of not having aviation and shipping under the Paris Agreement, but you still have a lot of regulations coming from the International Maritime Organization, which is still pushing a little bit some incentives here to actually go to a lower carbon solutions.
Yeah. Now, my point was not to criticize
you.
the Paris Agreement. I think it's just an isolated example where there was a consequence that wasn't intended. And you are right. I think that we welcome pragmatic and progressive regulation. It's not just the IMO either in our industry. Europe has been also active, and as Dane mentioned earlier, California doing their part too. So yeah, I think that those things are constructive.
All right, we've got a lot more questions, and for those of you who posted questions we didn't have time to get to, I apologize. Some of the technical questions we might take a look at afterwards. Let me hand back to Millie and Zdenka.
Great, thank you. Next slide. First, I want to thank Dane. Dane is a fabulous guy. He does this out of his love for innovation and his love for ocean exchange. We have a series, Barbara, there you are. We are more than a webinar. We give away free money to startups. For the MBAs in the audience, that is non-dilutive funds. We have our call for solutions that will be coming out, and we have a very interesting purse that we give to startups that are generally at TRL levels 6 through 8. Our event will be in Fort Lauderdale, Florida in the fall. We believe we can have a safe live event, as is our practice, and I'd like to talk to all of you about that, and there won't be enough time to do that. Find us at oceanexchange.org. Thank you to our sponsors. Roger represents our largest sponsor, Wallenius Wilhelmsen, but you see others here, and there are others listed on our website. We are a nonprofit. We cannot do what we do, including the award of non-dilutive funds, without the help of these sponsors. Thank you. Zdenka.
Great, thank you, Millie. Dane, I just want to thank our panelists. Your content was amazing, and even more so was your enthusiasm, and we all really care about the resource that we call the ocean, and that really came through in all of your presentation. It's been absolutely, and I know I speak on behalf of all of MTS and Ocean Exchange, it has been our privilege to host this kickoff event and to have you all participate. So as Millie said, for the audience that's out there, we have our next webinar series in April, but we challenge all of you to get involved with both the Marine Technology Society as a professional society and support the Ocean Exchange and take a look at the activities that they have going. So with that, the recording of this this webinar will be on both websites, and we'll follow up with everyone who has registered. We are thrilled that we had close to 180 folks listening through the last hour and a half. So With that, I think we'll close the seminar. And as Jane said, we're really sorry we didn't get to all of the great questions, but we'll keep those questions and cycle them through in the series. So with that, I think we are concluded.
Let me just comment, April 7th is that next webinar, and it will be about mobile power generation. So there'll be lots of publicity, but jot it down now and put it on your calendar. Thank you.
Great. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Dane.